and hope that somehow we'll get to some safety soon. Years ago, I was stuck at an airport in Charlotte, North Carolina. Have you ever been in that airport in Charlotte, North Carolina? It's an amazing airport. It has these kind of pods and long walkways. And I was on my way traveling back. I was about 40 years old, and I was on my way back from having given a lecture. And suddenly there was this equipment problem, and so we were delayed, and they had these beautiful rocking chairs that were out by the little areas there. So I sat in the rocking chairs for a while, and I waited, and I was hoping that somehow things would get a little bit better, and I thought this would be a good time for me to contemplate on my life. And then the equipment problem turned into a canceled flight, turned into a transfer to another flight, and turned into another cancellation. And so then it was about 10 o'clock at night, and they decided to put us up in a hotel. But as they were shifting us, they put us into this incredible van, and they left us unattended, a whole group of us, for about 45 minutes to an hour. So we could just really have a chance to think about our decisions in life. And so there we were in this van, waiting and experiencing all of that incredible experience. And there was a young couple in the first few seats, and they were holding a newborn. And the newborn began to cry and to be inconsolable. It had been a long day for her, and it had been a long day for the businessmen who sat in the back of the van, and they started to get a little bit antsy, and then they began to complain about the newborns crying, and then you could feel the temperature in the van start to rise, and you could experience that there was something going to happen, and somebody said, "Can't you get that baby to stop crying?" And then the mother handed the baby to the father, and he looked like he was about to become protective, and I suddenly realized that I had to say something. And so I merely said, "You have a beautiful baby." And at that moment, the father relaxed his grip on the child, and the child relaxed herself, and she immediately fell asleep. And then all of a sudden, all of that tension kind of melted away in the van as we waited. And later that night, as I was lying in the hotel, it was an awful room. The bed, was horrible. The kind of place that airlines put you up in when they keep you overnight. And I was reflecting on that whole exchange, and I was trying to think through what exactly had happened. And I realized that in that moment, I had channeled my father. And that my father was good at disarming people. And that struck me as unusual. It struck me as an incredible moment in my Christian walk, because my father was not someone who I grew up with that was known to be able to disarm people. In fact, if there was anything I knew about my father, is he was amazing at being incredibly violent. He struggled with addiction, and he was unafraid to advance himself or his interests when time was necessary. When I was a little boy, I was walking through a rough section of town, and these older boys, they were probably in their 20s, they mugged me. They took all the money that I had earned at a little part-time job I had, and I went home, and I was just devastated. And my father got a .357 and put it in his pocket and went down and threatened the boys' lives. And that seems like a really cool thing. When you see it in a movie, you think, wow, that's what really should happen, a kind of Charles Bronson moment. But think for a moment about living with that as a child. So when I became a Christian, it was an incredible decision to stop following things that were the forces of death in my life and the forces of sin in my life and that were diabolical forces in my life, and to turn towards Jesus and to find him as my Lord and my liberator and my love in my life. And I say all this because at that moment when I realized that I was channeling my father, I realized that he himself had been transformed. that the father that I had growing up was no longer the father I had as an adult. And because he had taken part in a spiritual program in which there was growth in an intentional development of his own spirituality, he had become the kind of person who could disarm people. And he is still alive. He struggles with dementia. He may not remember any of these events, but he is still very much a gentle person, a loving person, a kind person, a disarming person. And that has been the mark of God in his life. And I thought about my father this week because we are in the midst of celebrating and lifting up All Saints' Day. And we like to ask ourselves the question, who is a saint? And the Roman Catholic Church tells us that a saint is a particularly holy person that has made it through a stringent examination process in which the life of that person is evaluated, in which you look for heroic deeds of virtue, in which you look for ways in which they continue to heal people after their death, and finally you canonize them and you place them on a pedestal that people can pray to in the hope that they will pray for you. And the Roman Catholic tradition is only one tradition of being a saint. There are other ways of being a saint. In the Protestant tradition, we believe that everybody who is baptized is potentially a saint. And so all of us have a kind of claim to that life of holiness, that life of virtue, that life of healing. But I want to suggest to you today that a saint is not merely someone who is baptized. The saint is not merely someone who has passed a test of holiness. I want to suggest to you that anybody who embodies the love of God in this world is doing holy work and can be rightly called a saint. Anytime anyone embodies that love in the shape of forgiveness and the disarming remarks that we make so that we can get along, anyone who builds a bridge, anyone who loves in spite of animosity, anybody who forgives is rightly a saint. And so, in a sense, all of us are saints. And when we lift everybody up on this day, we lift up people who have been willing to lean into the love of God. And I think that that's an important way of thinking about what it means to be a saint. Traditionally, there is this incredible struggle in the Christian tradition between the different feast days we use to lift up our saints. We have All Saints' Day, which is a day in which we celebrate the love of God that has been manifest in the lives of our saints. And we have All Souls' Day, which we're going to celebrate at 6 p.m. tonight, which is where we give thanks for everybody that we have lost. And as one of my favorite bloggers says on the internet, on All Saints' Day we give thanks for Saint Mary, and on All Souls' Day we give thanks for Aunt Mary. And that's the way you need to think about it. But the point I want to make today is that every Saint Mary has been someone's Aunt Mary. We are all incredibly complex human beings. We all have our struggles with light and darkness within us. We all have our struggle in making God more at the center of our lives. We all have been called to heal and to be transformed by grace. We are all simultaneously sinners and God's beloved. Simul justus et peccator is what Martin Luther wrote. And he wrote truly, in my opinion. So every Saint Mary is also an Aunt Mary. And every one of you, no matter who you are, has the potential to be a saint. And we lift up certain people because in their lives they bear witness to the love of God in a special way that evokes that love in us. So when we say, who is a saint, we're asking ourselves, who among us is willing to rely and celebrate and lift up and embody the love of God in Christ to each other? And that potentially is everyone. always, no matter who you are, no matter how worthy you feel. Now, in our reading for today from the Gospel of John, we have an incredible image of what it means to be a saint. And I want to suggest to you that you can see in that image 3 different ways of being a saint. You see in the figures of Mary and Martha a kind of saintliness in terms of prayer. They have called and asked for Jesus to come and help them with their sick brother who turns out to die. And when Jesus comes, they implore him and say to him and complain to him that if he had been here, their brother would not have died. And so Mary and Martha, they are saints in prayer. They are unafraid to go to God constantly, no matter where they are, no matter what they're facing, and to ask God for help and to stay in relationship with God. And also in our gospel today, you have an image of sainthood in the figure of Lazarus, who, though dead, comes alive. And that is an example of the saint in transformation. Every saint seems to go through a moment of transformation when they give up the things that cause them death in their lives, and they reach out and hold on to those things that give them life and love and liberty. There's an old saying that says, every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. But in fact, what I believe is we are always saints and sinners at the same time, because we need that grace of transformation, that grace of coming to life, that grace of learning to love. And finally, we have in our gospel today an incredible image of Jesus as a kind of saint. Jesus, who is raising Lazarus from the dead, who has gone to see his friend, has invited incredible amounts of peril on himself. In the Gospel of John, the pivotal moment in Jesus' ministry, the moment where he incurs danger, the moment in which he begins to be seen as a problem to the religious authorities, happens when he heals and raises Lazarus from the dead. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's when Jesus makes a whip of cords and chases out the money changers from the temple. It's at that point that the religious authorities say, this guy, this MoveOn.org thing, it's over. It's over. We got to crush it. Jesus is a problem now. But in the Gospel of John, it is the resurrection that challenges people. And so when Jesus goes to raise Lazarus from the dead, he shows himself willing to engage in sacrifice. He shows himself willing to engage in empathy, weeping with Martha and Mary, even though he knows he is going to raise the dead. And so in this passage, Jesus is also a saint. And in fact, Jesus in some way is the model of saintliness. The piece of art I have for you today is from Jan Levens. He did it sometime after 1631. It's an etching after a painting that he did. He was a contemporary of Rembrandt. And it's one of my favorite depictions of the passage we have today, because you see in it on the bottom, you see Lazarus' little hands coming out of the grave, reaching up for something new. And you have all of the people and the women around looking at Jesus completely aghast and amazed at what God is doing. And finally, you have Jesus himself. And the reason why I like this so much is you see Jesus himself simply as someone who might be in a church praising God. Jesus looks like he might be singing in the choir. He looks like he's actually singing a tune, and he's engaging in this prayer, and Lazarus is coming to life. And that, I think, is the most important message for you today. Because a saint is someone who leans into the love of God. But every time we lean into the love of God, we become witnesses to the resurrection. Every time you and I choose to forgive, the resurrection comes not as something that's a reward at the end of life, but the resurrection comes now. Every time you forgive, every time you build a bridge, every time you walk in faith, every time you reach out to another, it's as if we could say, "Alleluia, Christ is risen."
The Lord is risen indeed. Hallelujah.
Where is your resurrection story today? How has God called you to be a saint today? What kind of prayer have you been called to offer? What kind of transformation is God working in you? What kind of relationship are you celebrating and building up and rebuilding and reconnecting and reconciling? What ways is God alive in you through your praises? These are the questions you and I ask ourselves today as we give thanks for all the saints before us, living and dead, who have borne witness to the resurrection and brought us into the love of God. Amen.
Amen.